He was a president. He was the tariff, the most, I guess, since me. I think I'm going to outdo him, but he was a tariff president. He believed that other countries should pay for the privilege of coming into our country and taking our jobs and taking our treasure. That's the way he explained it. They took our jobs and they took our treasure, and for that they should pay. And he made them pay.
The U.S. has had a turbulent relationship with tariffs, swinging between protectionism and open markets, depending on the political and economic climate. Protectionism refers to government policies that restrict international trade. Think of it as putting up a fence around your country's economy to shield local businesses from foreign competition. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods that make foreign products pricier, encouraging people to buy local instead. America's early days were heavily marked by protectionism. However, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the U.S. was riding high on relatively free trade, with an understanding that international commerce made large-scale wars too costly.
And he built a tremendous fortune. In fact, in 1887, they had the Great Tariff Committee was set up in 1887 because our country had so much money, we didn't know what to do with it. And they set up a committee of, as they called them, elites. A term that we have to change, because I think a lot of people that are elites aren't elite. I think the people that aren't elite are elite, so we're going to have to maybe switch that around somehow. But they had a committee that was set up to spend the money, because it was such a large amount of money at that time. It was nobody had seen anything like it. And it all came in from tariffs. And people didn't pay tax. There was no income tax system. I told you that came back in 1913. That came back and lived well for a while, and then you had the Great Depression.
The Underwood-Simmons Tariff of 1913 was the one to break the tradition of protectionism by lowering tariffs and introducing an income tax. This was a bold step toward free trade, but it didn't last long. World War I put nations, including the U.S., straight back into a protective mindset. By the time the U.S. emerged from the war, the political landscape had changed. European economies were recovering, and U.S. industries were facing new competition. American farmers who had been selling crops to Europe during the war were now losing those markets as European agriculture bounced back. To protect American industries and farmers from competition, the Emergency Tariff Act of 1921 was passed. But that was just the beginning. The real game changer came in 1922. During Harding's presidency, it was the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act, which raised tariffs above levels seen in 1913. The goal was simple: protect U.S. industries from foreign competition. But there was a catch. The Fordney-McCumber tariff had an unintended consequence. It crippled European exports to the U.S. With fewer American dollars flowing in, war-torn nations struggled to pay off their debts, deepening economic tensions. Instead of helping the global economy recover after World War I, the tariff made things even worse, creating friction between the U.S. and its allies, and slowing down Europe's post-war rebuilding efforts. Meanwhile, in the U.S., tariffs kept creeping up through the 1920s. These increases had a major impact on global trade, creating a skewed relationship between the U.S. and its trading partners. By the early 1930s, the world had fully embraced protectionism, and the U.S. had set the stage for the trade battles that would shape the global economy for years to come. This brings us to the very beginning of the Great Depression, a moment when the world seemed to spiral into chaos. The 1920s had been a decade of wild growth in the U.S. Everything was booming: new cars, radios, household appliances. Americans were buying it all and fueling a market boom that seemed unstoppable until it wasn't. And in October 1929, the stock market crashed. The Dow plummeted, losing nearly 90% of its value over the next few years. But the crash wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Once the market collapsed, everything else followed. The economy froze, banks failed, businesses went bankrupt, people lost their jobs, consumers, seeing their wealth vanish, simply stopped buying. Factories and stores shut down, the whole country ground to a halt. President Herbert Hoover decided to sign the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law in 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was often called one of the most catastrophic acts in congressional history. It's no surprise that roughly 1,000 economists literally begged President Hoover not to sign it. But despite his own reservations, Hoover went ahead anyway. Smoot-Hawley ignited what economist Chris James Michener called the mother of all trade wars. America's protectionism pushed Canada right into Britain's arms. Canadian exports to the UK surged, especially in agriculture. But this was just the start. A total of 25 countries would eventually strike back with tariffs of their own. Countries already struggling from the Great Depression suddenly faced even higher barriers to selling goods to the US, making an already bad situation worse. US exports to retaliating nations fell by 28 to 32%. Even countries that didn't retaliate still cut US exports by 15 to 23%. Global trade collapsed, dropping by 66% between 1929 and 1934. One country hit particularly hard was Germany. Already drowning in debt from World War I reparations, Germany relied on exports to earn the money needed to pay its bills. Smoot-Hawley cut off one of its key revenue streams, worsening its economic crisis. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Samuelson described it best. Cynics were delighted at the spectacle of a country trying to collect debts from abroad and at the same time shutting out their import goods that could alone have provided the payment for those debts. In other words, America wanted its money but refused to buy anything in return. Germany's financial collapse didn't just deepen its suffering. It paved the way for Adolf Hitler's rise to power. With the economy in ruins and desperation at an all-time high, extremist voices suddenly didn't sound so extreme. As businesses crumbled and unemployment soared, Hitler's promise of economic revival and national strength became terrifyingly appealing. Less than 3 years after Smoot-Hawley was signed, Hitler was the Chancellor of Germany. But the backlash against Smoot-Hawley wasn't just economic, it was also political. 35 governments lodged formal protests against it, and nations even formed new trade alliances to deliberately exclude the US. This fit right into the broader trend of American isolationism in the 1930s. But this kind of economic nationalism wasn't new. The phrase "America First" was already commonly used at the time to describe protectionist policies.
And then later, they tried to bring back tariffs, but the whole thing was, this was after the Depression. That was one of the great misconceptions, is people like to say, oh, but it was during the Depression. No, the country had a Great Depression, and then after the Depression, long after it started, they brought back tariffs to see if they could save it, but it took them really 25 years. When you say about 25 years to get out of the Great Depression, a lot of people don't understand that.
Since the predictable devastation that Smoot-Hawley brought, most presidents, Democrats and Republicans, have been largely free traders.
Presidents have sort of looked not to any particular section of the country in terms of what their trade interests are, but try to figure out what is the national interest in terms of trade, and have supported trade liberalization, getting other countries to reduce their trade barriers as we reduce ours through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and what have you. And presidents from Democrats, from Lyndon Johnson, Bill Clinton, to Republicans, Bush and Reagan, have always hearkened back to the days of Smoot-Hawley as a bad thing that Congress did in terms of trade policy, and that we're trying to warn people away from protectionism, the siren song of protectionism, which sort of seems there's this allure that it might help the economy, but really in practice makes things much worse.
Smoot-Hawley was a disaster. It's as simple as that. The sharp decline in global trade, the collapse of agricultural exports, and the retaliation from other countries all point to one undeniable fact. Protectionism simply doesn't work. It's like trying to save a sinking boat by patching one hole while drilling another. The New Deal, Roosevelt's game-changing blueprint for America's recovery, wasn't just about saving the banks and putting people back to work. It was about shaking things up and tackling the issues that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs had messed up in the first place. Remember, the Smoot-Hawley tariff strangled global trade and dragged the economy even deeper into the mess. So Roosevelt's plan was to do the exact opposite. One of his boldest moves during these efforts was the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. His goal was to break the cycle of retaliation and get trade flowing again. After all, a world that is trading is a world that is thriving. Roosevelt's act set the stage for the U.S. to pivot from isolationist policies to becoming the global champion of free trade. So in the years that followed, the U.S. took the lead in establishing major international trade agreements, including the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which later evolved into the World Trade Organization, or WTO. By tearing down tariffs and opening the doors for international cooperation, President Roosevelt showed that protectionism wasn't the way out, it was the way to stay stuck in a never-ending economic slump. But while Roosevelt's efforts were crucial, the real end to the Great Depression came with an unexpected twist: World War II. By the end of the war, the economy wasn't just back on track, it was booming. The stock market went on a bull run, and things started looking up for the American public. And that's what ended the Great Depression. The economic shift triggered by wartime demand, investment, and global trading channels. However, just because the U.S. managed to come out of the Great Depression doesn't mean the road was a smooth one. Quite the contrary, it was rocky, treacherous, and full of lessons that, frankly, we would rather not repeat. The damage done by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was catastrophic, and the scars from that period are still a part of economic history. So let's be clear, no one, and we mean no one, would want to go down that road again, right? Well, it turns out history isn't as far behind us as we might have hoped. The U.S. administration's rhetoric about tariffs today even has a certain nostalgia to it. But history has shown that tariffs are a risky game, and that is putting it mildly, especially today. Unlike the pre-World War II era, the global economy today is far more interconnected. Complex supply chains, particularly between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, mean that even small disruptions can cause major ripple effects. And that is where things get complicated. This isn't just about damaging one sector or one country, it's about jeopardizing entire economic ecosystems. When one domino falls, the ripple effects can be felt worldwide. America's tariffs, especially the ones imposed on China, could lead to real economic downturn. Experts warn that these moves could raise household costs, shrink U.S. economic output, and even trigger a broader trade war that could make the global recession of the 1930s look like a mild inconvenience. The America First approach might seem appealing in the short term, but if even a sliver of the chaos from the 1930s comes back, we could be facing a far grimmer reality. We can only hope that we've learned from those past mistakes.